Hello and welcome to the parish's Friday Nights Live. We're very sorry we can't be together in person, but happy we can still get together on Fridays at 5. I'm Alicia Longwell. I'm the Louis B. and Dorothy Coleman Chief Curator here at the Parish Art Museum. And firstly, I'd like to thank our wonderful sponsors who make these Friday night events possible. Our underwriting sponsor, the Bank of America, and also the Corcoran Group, and Stephen and Sandy Pearlbinder. Now, while we're together and during the course of the presentation and while I'm talking and you're looking, if you have any questions, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A. You can click on that and type in a question, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll try my best to answer as many as I can. Or if you have a comment, you can also do that in the chat column, and that'll be a great way for us to connect as well. Well, it's always helpful for that feedback and to know what else we might present or what else might interest our audience. And last week, of course, I spoke about Fairfield Porter and Anne Porter and the extraordinary circle of their friends, poets and painters, all something that writing poems and painting paintings was as natural for this group as breathing. I know we've all been doing a lot of reading recently, maybe more time than we ever thought we'd have to do that. And poetry, I read somewhere, someone described it as that lovely back door to consciousness. Bypassing our habitual barricades to thoughts and feelings, it reveals reality afresh. So I thought this might be a wonderful opportunity to look at Porter's paintings and Anne Porter's poetry and see what that might illuminate about that relationship and also all their fellow poets and painters. I'd like to start with just an excerpt, short, brief excerpt, about 3 minutes from an interview. Oh, all right, we all right? From an interview that I did in 2011. Andrea Grover, who was working with us at the parish at that point, set up the opportunity to tape the interview with Anne Porter. It was ultimately, she was almost 100 years old, but so we were able to do this, and she did in fact pass away that year, 2011. So it's wonderful to have this. It's going to be a clip talking about her lifetime relationship with poetry. Okay.
I had 3. The oldest was only 5 years older than I. My parents had their children very close together. My oldest sister, Barbara, my sister, Catherine, and my brother, Lawrence, and I were only about 5 years apart. And my brother was a year and a half older than I.
Okay. So you were the youngest?
I was the youngest.
Do you feel anything about your character or personality was sort of formed by being the youngest?
Very much.
Yeah.
So that you tend to fight for position and to find it hard to accept advice and direction, and it underlies a lot of one's behavior. You have to learn to control that because you're not always going to be the youngest anymore.
Now, I've read that you began to write poetry at a very young age. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yes. When we were staying in the winter with our great uncle, who was a grandfather to us, he was a banker. it was something called a financier. We didn't know what that was, but he wore a gold watch chain, and he would sit me on his lap and write down the poems I dictated to him. And he must have been very interested in poetry, because when I remember his bookshelves and looking through them, I found a first edition of Emily Dickinson, and I didn't know it was a first edition, but I was captivated by her poems when I could read. But at 7, he would sit me on his lap and write down my poems, which he was very supportive of. And there'd be poems about spring beginning. I beg you, sweet rosebud, I beg you arise. Come lift up your head and open your eyes. The robins are singing in blue of the skies. It was very trite. He would write that down and illustrate it with his fine pointed colored pencils and make up little books of my poetry and sew them together. And this, of course, was ultra supportive.
And was this remarkable to the rest of your family in that sense, or did?
They all wrote.
Did they?
Yes. But for some reason, it was something that belonged to me.
Wow. Oh, that's truly extraordinary, and how wonderful to have to hear Ann Porter talking about writing poetry as a child, and her support from her uncle, and that it was something that was just all hers. It was everything, something that belonged to her, and it continued to be that throughout her life as she wrote poetry. She didn't always show it to everyone. Her poet friends did read this, but it wasn't published until much, much later in her life. We're going to look at some paintings of Porter's along with her poetry. So we'll look at the PowerPoint. A Painter's Life. When I was 12 years old, I came upon the paintings of one who was a misfit like myself, a lonely, awkward man. He painted shaggy, whirling stars as big as suns and sunflowers with tawny manes as fierce as lions. He painted the fields ablaze with yellow wheat, and then in his narrow bedroom, he bandaged his face, and some old work boots he painted that he portrayed with reverence and care, like one who is transcribing a letter from the Lord. He painted the portraits of his village neighbors in order to belong to them, to be enfolded in their life, like the village doctor. He painted them with his most radiant colors. I wanted halos for them, he told his brother. This beautiful, beautiful poem, of course not written when she was 12, but a recollection of that feeling in looking at Van Gogh's paintings. And I think this early painting by Porter, 1949, they had been married for some years then, but seems to me to invoke that same sort of reverence for objects that she found so compelling in Van Gogh. And certainly a nod to the difference of Porter's remembering in the early days what took him literally, how hard it was to sell paintings. He really didn't sell many at all. It wasn't a question of gallery representation. One almost just carried paintings around to galleries and tried to sell them. Frank O'Hara, another extraordinary poet, said that Ann Porter always writes in a form that could be written by no one else. And I think she carries that distinctive uniqueness throughout her work. Next. This is Porter's wonderful portrait of Anne. On the right, he painted many, many of her throughout his lifetime. They had met in 1932 through a roommate of Porter's brother, Elliot Porter, the photographer. He invited Anne and her sister Barbara up to Great Spruce Head. This was an island in Maine that Porter's father had purchased many years before. Porter first went there when he was 6 years old, and it's where the family always gathered from their home in Chicago, and it was just part of the DNA of Porter. And he invited Anne there, and they came, and at one point they were going to take a, well, actually he said, would you get engaged if that would mean you could stay all summer? And Anne thought about it and she said, yes. And they decided to take a canoeing trip. And this poem is written about that canoeing trip they took on the mainland down the river. Lovers, I can still see the new weather, diamond clear, that flowed down from Canada that day when the rain was over. I can still see the main street 2 blocks long, the weedy edges of the wilderness around that sawmill town, and the towering shadows of a virgin forest along the log-filled river. We walked around in a small traveling carnival. I can still hear its tinny music and smell its dusty elephants. I can still feel your hand holding mine that day, when human, quarrelsome, but stronger than death or anger, a love was born. A truly extraordinary poem, and talking about those initial feelings with Porter, and that began their lives together. They were married that fall. The portrait from 1965 is, of course, one of Anne in Maine. That's the side of the clapboard house, the cottage there, the main building on the property. And this extraordinary, Porter always said color is form, form is color, and you see that here in these myriad shades of the gray. I think it's one of the tenderest portraits that he ever made of her. Next, please. Wartime Sunday. After they married, they lived in several places. They were in the, but around New York. She wrote this poem in the 1940s. They're not dates for all poems, but when I have them, I will tell you. This obviously written in the 1940s, and a work by Porter in the mid 1940s as well, when he painted many, many scenes of New York, certainly less well known than his other work. But equally as important, he had become a good friend of Rudy Burckhardt, whom we'll talk about a bit later as well. Burckhardt, very well known for, in the 30s and early 40s, photographs of New York. Wartime Sunday, in honor of Eugene Auger, photographer of Paris. From the time of a long ago war that destroyed only faraway cities, I remember a Sunday walk with the littlest of our sons. The vomit of Saturday night was wet in the doorways. No one was up. First Avenue empty and gray. So we turned a corner to stare at the 3 bridges, great webs of stillness over the East River. On our way home, passing the locked up shops, we saw one window heaped with tarnished lamps, guitars and radios and dusty furs, and there among them a pawned christening dress, white as a waterfall. The poet and critic David Shapiro once talked about Anne's poetry as being unembarrassed by the ordinary, even sordid details of life. And that quality, like Porter's, paying attention to the ultimate reality. Okay. Next. This is a poem dedicated to a grandson. The watercolor on the right is of their oldest daughter, Katie, 1949, the year of her birth. I think you can see what she is talking about in Joshua's case, as well as little Katie. This is a bedroom in Maine. I think we can tell these wonderful unmade beds and the eyelet around the bassinet. For Joshua, 1 month old, Joshua, your hands and fingers are so light and small that when you fall asleep, you rest them on the air. Gravity has no hold on them and has to leave them there. They spent every summer that they could in Maine. He once said when they moved out to Southampton in 1949 from the city, it was because he wanted to be sure if they couldn't afford to go to Maine, they could be near the ocean as well. Next slide, please. There we go. When the privet blooms. It's true that all the poetry is filled with domesticity and the realm of the domestic around houses. And she certainly talks a good deal about their home in Southampton. This is their wonderful retriever, Bruno, who actually was painted in the year of Porter's death in 1975. And he one morning went out for a walk with Bruno and had a massive heart attack and died. And Bruno waited for him there until help came. And this is Anne's poem called When the Privet Blooms. In their green innocence, the privet bushes planted as hedges around the great estates are hedges unawares, but they have deciphered the sun and they can read the windy seaside rain. And just at summer, they know it's time to bear their whitish blossoms. Then the hedge cutters come and climb on ladders to shear off the new growth and with it all the flowers. But on the overgrown, untended bushes around the edges of neglected meadows, you may still find those little spikes of blossom with their delicious fragrance. That's partly like sweet chocolate and a bit like rubber. You know, in many ways, she was closest in the circle of the New York poets to James Schuyler, for many reasons. This intimate poetry about nature. What Schuyler most admired in Porter's work and what he also found in Anne's poetry is that aspect of everyday life that is neither a snapshot nor an exaltation. It's art in that one values the everyday and as the ultimate, the most varied and desirable knowledge. And I think any poem dedicated to those tiny white blossoms, which we will all see this summer, is really extraordinary. Next, please. On the Main Islands, this is an excerpt from a longer poem. Although Anne wasn't raised there, she certainly identified it. She came to Big Spruce Head that first summer. She was 20. Fairfield was 25. Further to the interview, which is, we saw a bit of, it's also on Vimeo under Parish Art, and you can see the whole interview. But she said they were young, and in a way she said they were immature. They had children soon and sort of grew up together in that way. But she did love these islands as much as Fairfield. On the Main Islands, an excerpt. These granite and limestone islands, these tops of flooded mountains are scattered all over the bay. Their clearings shining with wildflowers, the live coals of hawkweed, the daisies fiery white, and fire-spun bird songs shiver over their scraps of forest. They're moated with ice-cold channels deep enough for a whale, where once or twice a summer with a slow throb of engines, the Swedish freighters go by. When the sun comes out, the sky speaks blue, and the whole bay down to its least cove takes on a dazzle of blue, becomes a field of splendor. This, you know, is an extraordinary poem, the way the use of language and the evocation of the natural surroundings and the attentiveness, I think, to the details. I mean, who would think of the slow throb of engines of Swedish freighters going by? But that was part and parcel of the sounds of the island. Next, please. This is wonderfully sort of comical poem, not something she always did, but this might have been, she might have written that the summer of 1953. She had written a letter to her mother that says, I hear that in the city we're called Porter's rest home for broken down New Yorkers. Now, these two broken down New Yorkers who came and stayed. On the left is Larry Rivers. This portrait from 1952. Larry Rivers had, in his disappointment from being, I guess, rejected by Jane Freilich, his proposal, had attempted a suicide, and Frank O'Hara had sort of rescued him and called up Anne and Fairfield and said, you have to take Larry in, he needs to rest and recuperate. So Porter actually got in his 1949 Willis Jeepster, drove into New York, picked up Larry, whom of course he knew, but not that well, brought him back. He recuperated there at the Porters. He loved it. He had wrote later about his cozy bedroom, and he read all of Proust that was out in the bookshelf in the room. So he actually stayed in Southampton. He liked it so much, he moved his sons out here, or his son, one son, the older son. Actually, he asked if he could come and live with the Porters, which he did for most of the school year, and saw that the boy got into school. And this is what the Porters did. They were nurturing to an extreme degree. On the right is James Schuyler, the poet Jimmy Schuyler, who sort of in the same was taken in. He had several nervous breakdowns. He was a brilliant, brilliant poet. And as I said, almost in sensibility, the closest to Anne in her writing. And well, the long story short is that he stayed over a period of about 11 years, both in Southampton and in Maine. Virtually a part of the family. She gets, and also Larry Rivers later wrote her hit the nail on the head remarks come across with guru brilliance. He says, she gets my vote, said Larry Rivers, for canonization after her great hospitality. And it, another, and he really said it, the whole house filled him with the awe of class, which having been born and raised in the Bronx, he said he really didn't know a whole lot about. My vote for canonization in 1952. Schuyler stayed over the years, an extraordinarily sort of uproariously hilarious person, unless of course he was making fun of you. He had a rapier wit and didn't hold back in his letters. House guests, all of us are coming. No, they're not coming. They may be coming. They may not be coming. 4 of them are coming. That is, if they are coming. 5 will come on Friday, 3 will leave on Sunday, 2 will come back Tuesday. That is, if they are coming. If they were coming, 2 of them would be coming, but they are not coming. 6 of them are coming. Very funny. Rings true. Next slide, please. Next PowerPoint. Jane awake. Jane Freilich was an extraordinary friend, fellow painter, fellow poet, and really muse to Frank O'Hara. Certainly John Ashbery was her first, was the first poet she met in this circle. They were all very young, Ashbery, O'Hara, and Kenneth Koch recently graduated from Harvard. She was living in New York and already sort of making a name for herself, painting. Frank O'Hara's poetry, extraordinarily different from the other writers, you might say. This is a 1953 study, 54 painting, a study for a larger painting that Fairfield did in 1953 when he and Anne had left Southampton, and we'll get to that fateful summer in a moment because that's when a film was made by Rudy Burkhart. But Jane was renting a place in Nyack, New York, sort of up the Hudson, and they went up to visit after they had sort of escaped the filmmaking that took up the whole summer. So this absolutely extraordinary scene, I think, that talks to me, speaks a lot about the lives they live, painting and reading and poetry. This is an excerpt from a longer poem, Jane Awake. The opals hiding your lids as you sleep, as you ride ponies mysteriously, spring to bloom like the blue flowers of autumn, each 9 o'clock. As curls tumble languorously towards the yawning rubber band, tan, your hand pressing all that riotous black sleep into the quiet form of daylight and its sunny disregard for the luminous volitions. Oh, and the budding waltzes we swoop through in nights. Before dawn, you roar with your eyes shut, unsmiling. So she was indeed a muse to many of those poets. Okay. Next. This is a volume that was published by the Museum of Modern Art after O'Hara's untimely death. He was killed on Fire Island in an car accident. And it's called In Memory of My Feelings, which is one of his most famous poems. And these were gathered together and artists illustrated them. This is Jane Awake with the illustration by Fairfield Porter. Okay, next slide. I'm having a little trouble reading these. Wait a minute. These are a series of paintings by Fairfield Porter, who is indeed also a poet. A volume was published. He did have several published in periodicals in his lifetime, and he was able to, a volume was published posthumously in after his death by the Thibordinage Gallery. I'm just going to make sure I can read the bottom here of the poem. Okay. Fairfield had a relationship, like many parents have with children. By the time everyone gets into adolescence, things change more or less. Lawrence was always happy to pose for his father. He felt it was a way to connect in times when it was often hard to connect with Porter. And this is a poem he wrote the year that Lawrence left for Harvard. Porter often liked to write in fairly complicated poetry forms, the sestina, but this is one that he seems to have written right from the heart. I'm sorry to be stumbling here, but I'm trying to read the last line here, which is, I can't see. Okay, here we go. Just a second. Sorry, everyone. Okay, this is The Loved Son from 1953. When a loved son turns his back and goes down the street on a bicycle become too small, his overcoat flapping absurdly behind him, maybe only as far as the beach. My heart is suddenly wrenched out of me, and I might as well let go and be done with it and stay heartless, for what use would regret be if my heart must no longer follow him? When the grown boy turns his back and leaves, looking forward to college or even to the army, glad to be grown up, happy to be gone, counting his new dependence as independence, I think how carelessly I have regarded him, with what little penetration I have known him and have not listened to the pleasant wit that marks the shrewdness of his watching mind. In whatever new place for a short time his home, surrounded by companions of his own age, carrying with him no baggage of infancy, but the disappearing scars of his childish wounds, his new friends now, freshly, for the first time, with contemporary, easy intimacy, in a flash of insight, looking in his eyes, know the depth of his love, of his being, and love him instantly. It's just a beautiful poem. And as I said, Lawrence often felt that he was closest to his father when he was posing for him. So there a series, many, many, many over the course of their lives together. All right, next slide. Here we are. This is the wonderful film. We're going to see a brief excerpt from this as well. I mentioned that the summer of '53, Fairfield had been very close with Rudolf Burckhardt. You see him there on the right, extraordinary Swiss who had moved to the States, became well known for his photographs. There's one in the center of Times Square and New York streets. A lot was talked about the choreography of people moving across the streets. I think you see that in Porter's paintings of New York as well. Burckhardt, who was also from the family of the famed Jakob Burckhardt, who wrote great histories in the 19th century, virtually cultural histories, virtually inventing the study of art history. So for that we're grateful. At any rate, he in the 50s was married to Edith Schloss. She's lower left there. She is in full regalia as the Comtesse de Caviar, Natalie, the Comtesse de Caviar. The film is called A Day in the Life of a Cleaning Woman. The complete scenario was apparently something devised by Anne. She really thought it up. It appealed to Rudy and Edith. They had come out to stay for a couple of weeks, which turned into nearly a month. And that's when the Porters thought, well, we'll just leave you here to finish up and we'll go up to Nyack and visit with Jane. So this was the summer there. That's a still upper left. The excerpt is, you'll see that the cleaning woman, played by Anne there, who's working for the imperious and very demanding Comtesse, she's Mrs. Rocker, the cleaning woman, is sort of overwhelmed by all her duties. This was something of an inside joke and also a sort of a satirical send-up of the Porter household, which, well, imagine that many children, that many visitors, however would the cleaning and the washing and the cooking and everything get done? She once and described this summer to her mother in a letter and saying, there's a lot going on here this summer. Much ado in the Beaux-Arts. Edith is literature, Rudy is cinema, Fairfield is painting, Lawrence is music, and I'm culinary, which is probably not an understatement because she was the someone had to prepare all the meals, and it was sort of a running joke that the table never really got cleared. Fairfield was famous for saying, don't move anything, I may paint it, and he would rearrange. So this is virtually a screenplay that she devised herself. The fact of the matter is there's a fairy tale aspect to it. It's a surreal moment that some people said, it was sort of thought that the Porters lived a rather enchanted life there and in Maine. It was probably anything but it makes a wonderful sort of fairy tale here. So you'll see the scene when the imperious Comtesse wants a poor, overworked Mrs. Rocker to do all the cleaning, and she stops to read a fairy tale to two little children. One is her own 4-year-old Katie, and the other is the Burkhart's 4-year-old son, Jacob. And someone comes out of the bushes and surprises her with a very magic something she can use to help her in her chores. And also she is acquainted with and grows quite fond of, in this brief cut, of the handyman there, one Elmer Turnip, who is of course Fairfield Porter. I won't tell you who the traveling salesman is with the magic wand, but Fairfield Porter. Ultimately, everything ends happily in this fairy tale, which we don't have the full time to watch, but it's quite a brilliant film. Burkhart was very well known for these sort of smaller art films that he made during the 50s and 60s. So let's see the film. Thank you, Jerry. The excerpt. Well, of course, can you hear me? Well, of course, the traveling salesman was none other than Larry Rivers, always available for a lark. And just to tell you what happens, no surprise, Elmer Turnip and Mrs. Rocker get happily married there in the end. And Larry, the traveling salesman, turns out to be the Comtesse's long lost brother. So they have a reunion and everyone lives happily ever after. There's your fairy tale. It's been a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I wonder if there are any, let's see, let me check the Q&A, my favorite part here. Hello, shout out to Bill Kern of Friends and Anns and a friend of mine. Absolutely, from Michael Olson. Is the talk available as a recording? It will be posted in a couple of weeks. Our wonderful resident wizard, Victor, will have that edited and posted in a few weeks. Yes. Great job, Alicia. Thank you. Bill, good job. You know, I'm still teaching. Are you in touch with him? I am not in touch with someone is asking me about Lawrence, and I am in touch with, yes, the porter's daughter, Elizabeth, who lives here. Liz. Any other? Do I check the chats? Yes, Jane Awake was the illustration for that spread from In Memory of My Feelings was by Alex Katz. Do you think a question, do you think Anne was invited to write poetry by Fairfield or the opposite? And where did she go to school? She, well, no, I mean, as you know, in the interview, she really wrote from childhood. I think Fairfield encouraged her. Yes, I do, all along. And where did she attended Bryn Mawr for a couple of years, and then she said there were nothing but girls and books, and she came back and went to Radcliffe. James Lester, Nancy. Let's see. Okay. Does the museum have the painting of Lawrence, the painting of the boy opening the door to outside? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. I might say, the person is saying they have not seen it. Anne Porter made an extraordinary gift to the museum. Basically, it was the paintings that remained in the studio in the house. It's about over 200 works. Many are small on masonite sketches. Some that's one of the smaller works that we have. We have seen it, but it's been an extraordinary and rich trove of the work of an individual artist of such stature. And when Anne gave it to the estate, really, but Anne really wanted it to come to the museum to always be accessible. She knew that some would be, basically a study collection, not always exhibited. And I have to say that we have always accepted that trust and had, even when works aren't on view, but for scholars, other painters who come and want to see the work in depth, we do that for them as well. That's a pledge we made to Anne. Let's see, anyone? I think I'm trying. Ooh. It's all very nice. I'm glad you all enjoyed it. Is the painting of Anne Porter by Jane Fralick available? Well, it's the sketch for the bigger painting. We have shown that is the bigger painting is another museum. I'll go in the. Oh, that is the Q&A. All right. Well, I hope I've answered all of them. You're also very nice to write in. How did she and Fairfield meet? My understanding is that she met through, I think, Elliot Porter, Fairfield's brother, who was, of course, the very well-known photographer. His roommate had a date with her sister, that kind of thing. That kind of, you know, before the internet, you had to get out there and meet people. But 8 pieces of Anne's are watching. 3 great nieces of Anne's are watching. How wonderful. Hello to all of you. She was extraordinary. It was my great, great privilege to know her. She, as we call this, a poet among us. I think many of you know that she continued to live in Southampton after Fairfield's death in 75. That the house on South Main was sold, and a little cottage was built in the back for her, and the adjoining stable, the 19th century stable, which was Fairfield's studio in the hall, the second story, the hayloft. And many of you probably know that Patton Miller, who was then shortly after Fairfield's death, actually he was a student at Southampton College and apparently had been looking for a studio. And he somehow met Anne, and she said, well, I have a studio. And he worked there for many, many years until Anne moved, and they were great, great friends. And it was lovely. She felt it was wonderful that there was a painter in the studio. Are a couple of the poems unpublished? No, of Anne's. No, those that I read have all been published in the volume. Still owned by the family. No. How about the home on Great Spruce Head? I'm not terribly sure. There were 5 siblings of Porters. I'm sure the family is still there in the summers. So this is wonderful. This is a great, great pleasure for me to talk about these extraordinary, intriguing, and just brimming with talent. If you ever get a chance to read any of Jimmy Schuyler's letters, they are pretty hilarious. It's a treat to, I feel like I've sort of been at a cocktail party with all of them out of the house. It's nice. And wonderful to be with all of you too. Thanks so much. And another Friday night next Friday. Thank you. Good night.